The charity auction was the kind of event where wealth didn't just whisper, it roared. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of towering crystal chandeliers, each droplet refracting light like 1,000 tiny diamonds. Waiters in white gloves moved silently between silk-draped tables, balancing trays of champagne flutes that clinked softly as they passed. The air was perfumed with an intoxicating blend of expensive colognes, freshly polished wood, and the faint, delicate aroma of imported flowers arranged in crystal vases at every corner. The guests, draped in couture gowns and tailored tuxedos, mingled with calculated ease, exchanging practiced smiles, subtle glances, and the kind of small talk that hinted at million-dollar deals behind every laugh. The stage at the far end of the grand ballroom was lit just enough to draw the eye. A long table displayed the night's treasures, rare art pieces, signed memorabilia, handcrafted jewelry, and items so exclusive they weren't even listed in the official catalog. Behind each lot stood a story, a cause, and a carefully curated allure meant to loosen the grip of even the most shrewd bidder's wallet. A professional auctioneer, dressed in an impeccably pressed black suit, stood ready at the podium, his gavel resting lightly in his hand, his voice already warming up for the night's fast-paced rhythm. Near the front, the most coveted seats had been reserved for the power players, the kind of people whose names opened doors, whose opinions swayed markets, and whose donations could single-handedly fund entire projects. Their laughter floated above the hum of conversation, confident and unrestrained, their every gesture betraying the certainty of their own importance. Photographers discreetly captured candid moments, angling for shots that would make tomorrow's society pages, where names and faces would be paired with whispers of influence. The energy in the room was a peculiar blend of generosity and competition. While the event was wrapped in the noble cloth of charity, everyone knew the unspoken truth. The auction was as much about being seen as it was about giving. Winning a bid wasn't just about the item, it was a public declaration of status, a subtle reminder of one's place in the hierarchy of influence. Every paddle raised wasn't merely a gesture of goodwill, it was a signal to the room, a silent assertion of dominance. At one side of the room, a grand piano stood as a decorative centerpiece, its glossy black surface reflecting the golden light, a reminder that a live performance would punctuate the evening's midpoint. The pianist, already seated, ran her fingers through quiet scales, her notes mingling softly with the low murmur of voices. Waiters replenished glasses with the precision of choreographed dancers, ensuring no guest's drink sat empty for more than a moment. Silver platters of delicate hors d'oeuvres, truffle-infused bites, miniature lobster rolls, and perfectly crisped blinis topped with caviar, circulated among the crowd, each offering a fleeting taste of extravagance. Outside, a fleet of luxury cars lined the valet entrance, their polished exteriors gleaming under the flash of cameras as late arrivals stepped onto the carpet. Paparazzi and event photographers snapped eagerly, capturing every glittering detail from designer shoes to diamond necklaces. The murmurs outside hinted at the excitement within, where fortunes would shift hands in a matter of minutes, and reputations could be elevated or quietly diminished, all under the guise of philanthropy. Inside, the auctioneer's assistant moved between the tables, checking bidder cards, confirming details, and subtly gauging interest. The guest list had been curated to perfection, each attendee had the means to make a difference and the ego to make sure it was noticed. Around the edges of the room, representatives from the beneficiary organizations waited quietly, hopeful that the generosity in the air would translate into record-breaking numbers. The lighting, strategically designed, kept the audience in a warm, flattering glow while spotlighting the stage in a way that seemed to almost compel the eyes forward. The first items were displayed with deliberate slowness, giving guests time to appraise and anticipate. Conversations hushed as the opening speech concluded and the auctioneer prepared to start the first lot. There was a palpable sense of performance to the proceedings. Every bid, every nod, every pause in the action was part of an unspoken choreography, one that the regular attendees knew well. In the back, the less visible tables hosted guests who weren't on the society pages but who still carried the quiet authority of wealth, business owners, old money families, and discreet investors who preferred influence without attention. These were the people who might make the highest bids without ever stepping into the spotlight, content to let others take the applause while they moved pieces behind the scenes. The atmosphere tightened as the auctioneer lifted the gavel for the first time, his voice rolling smoothly through the air, announcing the starting bid. A few hands shot up quickly, almost casually, signaling their intent without hesitation. The pace was brisk, the energy sharpening with every counterbid. The soft shuffle of paddles raising, the rustle of gowns as guests shifted forward, the occasional burst of laughter, all blended into the pulse of the room. She sat at one of the front tables, her posture effortlessly elegant, as though the chair itself had been designed to complement her presence. The billionaire's wife was the kind of woman people noticed without quite meaning to, perfectly coiffed hair in glossy waves, diamond earrings catching the light with every tilt of her head, and a gown that whispered of couture houses where price tags were never discussed aloud. Every move she made was deliberate, the flick of her wrist when adjusting her bracelet, the languid way she sipped champagne, the slow survey of the room as if mentally arranging everyone into their proper place. Around her, a small circle of admirers leaned in when she spoke, eager to catch every word, even when her tone carried that light, airy condescension reserved for those who knew they would never be challenged. The auction was still in its early momentum when her attention shifted. Across the aisle, at a table positioned just shy of the main spotlight, sat a woman whose presence, in her mind, didn't quite fit the polished aesthetic of the night. She was dressed simply, well-kept but understated, her hair pulled back neatly, her jewelry modest compared to the glittering excess all around her. She carried herself with quiet confidence, but to the billionaire's wife, this was not the kind of confidence she recognized or valued. It was the wrong kind of confidence, one that didn't draw attention, didn't beg to be validated by whispers of approval. A smile curved the billionaire's wife's lips, but it was the kind of smile that didn't warm her eyes. It lingered there, almost imperceptibly mocking, as she exchanged a few murmured words with the woman seated to her right. The comment, though quiet, carried just enough amusement to make her companion glance across the room and stifle a laugh. It was subtle, practiced, an unspoken performance between those who understood the silent hierarchies of rooms like this. When the auctioneer announced the next lot, an item clearly meant to stir excitement, a rare art piece with provenance that stretched back centuries, the billionaire's wife's attention was still locked on the other woman. She leaned back in her chair, glass in hand, the picture of relaxed superiority. The bidding began, the first numbers rolling off the auctioneer's tongue in that quick, rhythmic cadence. Paddles lifted here and there, numbers climbing with predictable speed. And then, the modestly dressed woman across the aisle lifted her paddle. The billionaire's wife noticed immediately. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in surprise that the woman could bid, but in amusement at the audacity of it. She turned again to her companion, this time allowing her comment to be accompanied by a soft laugh, just enough for those nearby to glance over. In her mind, she had already decided the outcome, this woman was out of her depth. The bidding would rise quickly, the numbers would reach a point where hesitation would betray financial limits, and then the moment would pass, leaving nothing but the faint sting of embarrassment. With each counterbid, the billionaire's wife's expression shifted ever so slightly. It was still composed, but there was a trace more focus now, a sharper glint in her eyes. She had not expected the woman to match the room's pace so seamlessly. The paddle kept rising, not with the flashy bravado some bidders used to make a point, but with calm precision. The billionaire's wife tilted her head, steadying her as if trying to read a puzzle she'd never encountered before. The murmurs around the table grew faint as she listened to the auctioneer's escalating calls. She could still hear the laughter from her side of the room, could still feel the weight of the unspoken agreement among her circle, that the woman across the aisle was not truly a player here, but there was something about the quiet certainty in that bidding that began to gnaw at her. She hid it well, but the rhythm of her champagne sips slowed, and her eyes rarely left the other table. Every time the paddle lifted, it was like a silent defiance, one that didn't need words or declarations. The billionaire's wife, accustomed to rooms where wealth was flaunted with effortless arrogance, found herself caught between mockery and intrigue. She leaned slightly forward, as though closing the physical distance might help her understand the scene unfolding before her. The room was alive with the thrill of competition, but for her, it was becoming something else entirely, a personal curiosity, a need to understand what exactly this simple woman thought she was doing in a room where unspoken rules dictated who belonged and who did not. The bidding war had already begun to pull the attention of the room, drawing eyes away from their small table conversations and onto the two figures whose paddles seemed locked in a steady rhythm. The auctioneer's voice was quick and practiced, announcing each new number with the kind of energy that kept the crowd on edge, urging the bids higher and higher. From her place across the aisle, the woman the billionaire's wife had so easily dismissed kept her expression calm, almost serene, as though the figures being called out were insignificant to her. She did not fidget, did not lean toward anyone for counsel, did not whisper into the ear of a companion. She simply waited for the auctioneer to lift his eyes toward her table and, when the moment came, raised her paddle without hesitation. It wasn't just the act of bidding, it was the way she did it. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic lift meant to draw gasps or admiration. It was quiet, purposeful, almost businesslike, as if she were selecting fruit at a market and not spending what most people would consider the down payment on a house. The absence of theatrics made it stand out all the more in a room where every move was typically a performance. People were beginning to notice that her bids were steady, unshaken by the escalating numbers, and that she never once looked flustered. The billionaire's wife watched her closely now, the earlier smirk having softened into something more curious, though still laced with a hint of condescension. She tried to read her. Was she here on a dare, trying to impress someone, or perhaps acting out of a naive misunderstanding of just how high these bids could go? The woman gave nothing away. Her hands rested lightly on the table between bids, her gaze fixed not on her rival but on the auctioneer, as if she trusted the process and knew exactly where this would end. Around the room, murmurs began to circulate. A few guests exchanged knowing looks, while others tilted their heads to whisper to their companions. It wasn't every night that someone outside the usual social circle challenged the unspoken hierarchy of the bidding floor. Those who recognized the billionaire's wife knew that her presence in any auction was more than symbolic. She was accustomed to winning, and to doing so with a flourish. To see her bids matched so calmly, without the faintest trace of strain, was a quiet spectacle all on its own. The auctioneer's rhythm quickened. 200,000. Do I hear 250? The billionaire's wife lifted her paddle with the practiced grace of someone who had done this dozens of times. Without even glancing in her direction, the other woman followed, her paddle rising just as smoothly. The gavel tapped lightly against the podium as the auctioneer's voice rose over the soft hum of the crowd. 300,000. Do I hear 350? The tension between them was subtle but unmistakable. The billionaire's wife leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing one leg over the other in a move that spoke of control, but her eyes never left her opponent. Across the aisle, the other woman sat upright, her shoulders relaxed, her movements measured. It was a battle of composure as much as it was a battle of wealth, and for those watching, it was impossible to tell which would falter first. With each new bid, the numbers climbed into territory that would have made most attendees hesitate, but there was no hesitation here. The paddles rose like clockwork, each lift carrying the same unhurried confidence as the last. The audience was caught between anticipation and disbelief, their gazes flicking between the two women as if waiting for one to betray a crack in her armor. The item itself, a painting from a sought-after but notoriously selective artist, had already doubled its estimated value. Yet the focus had shifted away from its worth. This was no longer simply about art, it had become a test of willpower, pride, and perhaps something deeper that no one yet understood. Each number called out by the auctioneer seemed to echo louder than the last, not because of its size but because of what it meant in this silent duel. What no one in the room could have guessed, not even the billionaire's wife who prided herself on knowing everyone worth knowing, was that the bids coming from the simple woman's table were not made on her own account. The truth, invisible beneath the elegance of the night and the clinking of crystal, was that every number she confidently offered was being backed by the very person who had mocked her only moments earlier. It was a fact hidden in plain sight, buried beneath the delicate layers of social performance and silent assumptions that floated through the air like the faint scent of expensive perfume. The arrangement was quiet, deliberate, and known to only a select few. There was no paper trail lying on the table, no whispered cues exchanged between the two women that anyone could catch. The transfer of power happened elsewhere, before the night began, through conversations carried out in private spaces far from the glittering lights of the auction hall. The billionaire's wife, for reasons that would remain unspoken to the casual observer, had arranged for the woman to be in that seat, holding that paddle, bidding with an authority that seemed entirely her own. The mechanics of it were flawless. To the crowd, the simple woman appeared as just another guest, her presence unremarkable compared to the parade of designers and socialites in the room. Yet beneath the surface, the money fueling her bids came from the very bank accounts the billionaire's wife controlled with the same precision she applied to her jewelry collection. The irony of it was sharp. Here was a woman exercising financial muscle that wasn't hers in name, yet was being used with a composure that made it seem entirely natural. From across the aisle, the billionaire's wife continued to watch, her expression betraying nothing of the truth. She allowed herself the occasional curl of a smile, the kind that could be mistaken for confidence in her own position, but was in fact something more layered. She was watching a performance of her own making, and yet there was an undercurrent she hadn't anticipated, the growing attention the other woman was commanding. What had started as a small ripple in the room was becoming a quiet tide, drawing more and more eyes toward her table. The arrangement had not been designed for spectacle. If anything, the billionaire's wife had expected the other woman's presence to go largely unnoticed, her role confined to a discreet transaction that would serve whatever purpose the evening required. But the way she bid, the steadiness, the ease, was starting to shift the energy in the room. People who had barely looked her way before were now following the auctioneer's gaze to her, tracking every rise of her paddle as if it carried its own weight of mystery. The auctioneer, trained to spot the dynamics that kept the energy alive, had begun to linger a fraction longer on her table when announcing a bid. His voice seemed to sharpen slightly each time she raised her paddle, as though acknowledging her growing influence on the pace. Even the waitstaff, moving soundlessly through the crowd, found their eyes drawn toward the quiet duel playing out between the two women who, to the unknowing, appeared to be strangers caught in an evenly matched contest. And yet, it was not a contest at all. One woman was bidding from her own means, the other bidding with funds handed to her, ironically, by the very rival she was now challenging in public. It was a dynamic that defied the room's unspoken rules, where financial power and social dominance were supposed to be aligned, not split between two bodies moving independently. The invisible thread connecting them was something no one in the audience could see, and that secrecy gave the moment an added charge. Every time the paddle lifted, it was a movement backed by both women, one in the open, one hidden behind layers of pretense. The billionaire's wife knew the ceiling on those bids better than anyone, yet there was something strange about watching them unfold. The woman across the aisle wasn't rushing, wasn't overeager, she moved at her own measured pace, as if she were the one dictating the flow rather than following someone else's resources. From the outside, it appeared that the simple woman was pushing against the power of the billionaire's wife. But in truth, she was powered by it, carried by it, and, whether intentionally or not, transforming it into her own display of authority in the most public space possible. That paradox began to take on a life of its own in the eyes of those watching, creating a quiet tension that no one could name but everyone could feel. The auction had reached the point where the air itself seemed heavier, charged with an anticipation that neither music nor chatter could dilute. Numbers that once drew murmurs of surprise were now passing without pause, the crowd fully invested in the duel that had captured their attention. Eyes darted between the two women, whispers trailing from table to table, the nature of their connection unknown but the tension unmistakable. The auctioneer's voice carried with a practiced sharpness, each new figure announced like the crack of a whip, urging the bids to climb ever higher. The billionaire's wife remained poised, every gesture deliberate, every expression carefully curated to suggest complete control. She lifted her paddle with the ease of someone who could outlast any competition, yet there was a subtle quickening in the timing between her bids. Across the aisle, the other woman sat with that same unshakable calm, her hands steady, her eyes unwavering as if the numbers were nothing more than passing milestones on a road she knew well. Each time she raised her paddle, she did so without glancing toward her rival, as though the billionaire's wife was not even part of the equation. This refusal to acknowledge her, at least openly, had begun to shift the balance of the room. What had started as a contest between two bidders was becoming a silent commentary on presence itself. The billionaire's wife commanded attention by the sheer force of her reputation, the other woman commanded it by doing nothing to seek it. That quiet defiance unsettled something unspoken, and it showed in the subtle changes in the billionaire's wife's posture, the slight tension at the corner of her mouth. The auctioneer, sensing the energy, slowed his cadence at key moments, allowing the silence between bids to stretch just enough to make the audience lean forward. The pauses felt deliberate, as if giving the room a chance to absorb the weight of each new figure before pressing onward. And in those seconds of stillness, the sound of a paddle being raised was amplified, not just as a physical act, but as a statement. The woman's paddle rose with the same unhurried certainty, her movements almost rhythmic now, as though she had settled into a pace only she could hear. The crowd's curiosity had shifted into something closer to fascination. People who had been halfway through conversations let their sentences trail off, their eyes locked on the two women. There was a certain intimacy in the way they exchanged no words yet seemed locked in constant communication through the language of the auction, one asserting dominance through tradition, the other through quiet persistence. It was the kind of moment that left even the seasoned guests unsure of where their loyalties lay, drawn to both the power and the restraint they were witnessing. The lot on the block, once a celebrated centerpiece of the evening's offerings, had become secondary to the human drama surrounding it. Even the auctioneer's descriptions of its rarity and craftsmanship seemed like background noise now, a formality to keep the process moving while the real story unfolded. The bids leapt higher than anyone had expected for this particular piece, propelled less by desire for the item and more by the momentum of the two women's silent contest. The billionaire's wife's friends, seated close enough to catch the smallest shifts in her demeanor, exchanged glances. They knew her well enough to see that while her exterior remained composed, the presence of this unyielding rival was forcing her to hold her ground in a way she had not anticipated. The others in the room, socialites, patrons, collectors, watched with the thrill of witnessing a disruption to the usual order of things, the kind that didn't happen often in circles where power was so tightly managed. Each figure announced by the auctioneer felt like another turn of a screw, tightening the connection between them. Neither woman showed signs of slowing, and yet the room could feel something approaching, as though the standoff could not continue indefinitely without reaching a decisive moment. The lighting above seemed warmer now, the air denser, the space between the two tables charged with an almost physical weight. Every eye was drawn to them, as if the entire ballroom was waiting for the instant when one would finally tip her hand. The moment the final number was called, the room seemed to hold its breath. The auctioneer's voice rang out clear, his cadence slowing as if to savor the weight of the figure. His gavel hovered in the air, the polished wood gleaming under the chandelier's light, suspended between action and conclusion. All around, eyes flicked from him to the two women who had carried the night's energy to this point, the unspoken question hanging thick: who would claim the prize, and what would it mean when they did? The billionaire's wife sat perfectly still, her hand resting lightly against the stem of her champagne flute. Her expression gave nothing away, though the faintest flicker in her eyes betrayed a sharpened focus. She was not merely watching the auctioneer, she was watching the other woman, studying her, measuring the exact moment her resolve might falter. Across the aisle, the simple woman's face remained unreadable. Her paddle lay on the table for the moment, but her fingertips hovered near it, a signal only the auctioneer seemed to notice. The pause stretched long enough for the murmurs to start again, small ripples of sound moving through the crowd as people exchanged theories in hushed voices. The staff froze in place, trays suspended midair, sensing the delicacy of the moment. Even the pianist at the far end of the room, preparing to resume the evening's music, kept her hands poised above the keys without striking a single note. Then, without any sign of strain or hesitation, the woman reached for her paddle and lifted it with the same quiet precision she had shown all night. The motion was small, almost understated, yet it rippled through the ballroom like a dropped stone in still water. The auctioneer's eyes lit up, his gavel lowering fractionally as he called out the new figure, the number hanging in the air like a final, irreversible move in a game that had been building for hours. For a heartbeat, the billionaire's wife did not move. She could have lifted her paddle, could have pushed the bidding higher, but instead she remained still, her gaze locked on the woman across from her. It was not the stillness of defeat, nor of disinterest, it was the stillness of calculation, of a mind working through a puzzle no one else in the room could see. Around her, the tension broke into scattered whispers, the shift in energy so sudden that a few heads turned toward the stage as if to confirm what had just happened. The auctioneer's gavel came down at last, the sharp crack echoing against the marble and velvet of the ballroom. Applause erupted almost instantly, polite at first, then swelling into something more animated as guests processed the outcome. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment the winning bidder's name was called, though most in the room already knew exactly who she was, or at least thought they did. The billionaire's wife's circle clapped as well, their expressions carefully neutral, though their eyes betrayed a restless curiosity about what had just unfolded. The simple woman sat with a composure that seemed immune to the sudden wave of attention. She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the auctioneer as the item was declared hers, then lowered her paddle onto the table once more. Conversations bloomed in every corner, threads of speculation weaving together into a tapestry of rumor that would be carried far beyond the walls of the ballroom. The mystery of her confidence, her seemingly limitless bids, was now cemented in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The item itself was swiftly removed from the stage, carried with ceremonial care toward the back of the room, but it no longer held the spotlight. All eyes had shifted back to the two women, the winner, and the one who had let her win. They were still separated by the width of the aisle, yet the air between them felt charged, as if something invisible had passed between them in those final seconds. The applause faded, replaced by the low murmur of conversations reigniting, but the room's attention never fully drifted away from their table. From the edges of the crowd, those who had only caught fragments of the duel now tried to piece the story together, leaning in to hear whatever scraps of information their neighbors might offer. The staff moved again, topping off glasses and offering fresh plates, but even their practiced efficiency could not erase the lingering question hanging over the night. Somewhere in the space between victory and concession, between what was seen and what was hidden, the story of the evening had already taken root, destined to be retold long after the last guest left the marble-floored ballroom.